Hi there, Director of Photography, Alec Watson, and welcome back to our workshop on slider fundamentals. When I say welcome back, I am doing a redo of my part. Apparently, we broke the internet, which is always a bummer. I hear there were bandwidth issues, and my apologies for that. It's possible that there was a Zoom setting that was wrong. I'm going to go with broke the internet because there was tons of people on the call, which was awesome. So thank you for all for showing up. I thought rather than give you guys a blurry version for playback, you know what? I'm just going to redo it. And if you get something out of this information, then that is the whole point. So this is my redo of what I was talking about. So we started off with slider fundamentals. For me, I wanted to talk about blue skies and where blue skies go wrong. And this took me a long time to learn about because it's not exactly totally obvious. I also have the benefit now of knowing of some different levels of where people are at photography-wise. So when I talk about stops, I maybe got a little technical. So I'll do my best to use less jargon when I explain this. So blue skies. One of the things that I always keep in mind with blue skies is that I think about the sky in 4 quadrants, kind of like north, south, east, west, except it rotates with the sun. So the sun is what we call our key light. I have a key light over here. Key light means just like the brightest light. The brightest light out there is the sun. Now, when I have somebody looking kind of into the sun, they're really squinty, right? Like I'm squinty looking into this light right now. Not that pleasant for me to look into. But if I take a picture of a person that's front lit by the sun like that, so if that's my key light, I'm taking a picture that way. They're squinting. I have a great blue sky behind them. Looks fantastic, looks really punchy. Unfortunately, because I want to take pictures of people, that's probably not a great shot with them doing that. Now, on the left and right of where the sun is, so sun's here, left and right, that's going to be where a polarizer really works. And so if anybody ever uses a polarizer or wonders whether to get a polarizer, that's the spot it works in. So polarizer makes no difference there. You can have a blue sky. Makes no difference looking into the sun apart from, it's like sunglasses, a little darker. But you turn it sideways like this and then rotate it and it's just like, boom, there's where the deep blue comes in. And you can remember that from where your shoulders are. So when I'm taking a photo, if I've got the sun on a shoulder or this shoulder over here, I can use a polarizer. So then sometimes I'll be thinking, oh, I'll get that from my bag. The downside of that is polarizers for skin on people. I don't really like what they do. They tend to shift the color unless you get a really, really good polarizer, so a really expensive one. It doesn't give you the best skin tones around. So the only time I use a polarizer is when I want that really deep blue punchy look for some reason. Now, what I like best for photos is photographing into the sun. And I photograph people that way, so they're backlit. And unlike me, when they're backlit, their hair lights up really nicely. So they've got this nice wrap around them. They're also lit on the front, and this is weird to think of. They're actually lit by what's over here, which most of the time is going to be a big blue sky. So that's going to make them a little bit bluish, a little bit of a blue cast because they're lit by a blue light. You can fix this in 2 places. You can fix that in post. We'll go over that by changing your color temperature. You can change your white balance. So when I was saying I'll stay away from jargon, I'll stay away from color temperature. We'll change your white balance. You can actually go for shade. Because when you're shooting somebody and they're backlit by the sun, they're actually in the shade. They are shading themselves. Shade really means that it's not lit by the sun, it's lit by something else. And if it's a sunny day, they're lit by a blue sky. It makes them very blue, right? And so shade adds a lot of warmth, adds a lot of red into the picture to cancel that out, and it'll get you your warm skin tone back. If you're shooting in RAW, which I always recommend, we can do that in post. if you want to see it in camera while you're shooting it. Changing your white balance to the shade one, that's going to, usually on most cameras, it looks like a little house with some lines coming from it. Very strange idea. The idea of that one is that if you were on the other side of a building, then you're in the shade, lit by the blue sky. That's what the shade one is. It's an odd graphic, but that's what it means. So one of the things that I'll do, and I'm bringing this up because this all comes into sliders, and so we can correct some of these things. But if we can get shots right in camera, it's always better because it's hard to save everything. We're going to go over that in this lesson. This guy here, a pop-up, a 5-in-1 pop-up. I take this on vacation with me. I take this to all the shoots with me. This is value for money, the best investment for shooting people that you're going to come across. So fairly small, fits in a backpack. If I am shooting somebody backlit by the sun, I can bounce some sun back into them. Now, often you'll see people tipping it up, and it's kind of like they want to put it 90 degrees to the sun or perpendicular to the sun and bounce all that light back at the person. This is a reflector, right? If I'm reflecting light and making a key light from underneath, that's kind of lighting from underneath. It's not a particularly nice looking light. So I like to light from above. So I'll often get somebody, if I can, to hold it up behind them like that and bounce some light down. And that way their arms won't get tired. They can sit there for quite a time, bounce the light down. You get a really nice light. The other way that you can use one of these, and I do this all the time as well, I'm going to show you an example of this, is this is a scrim. When the sun comes through it, it's quite opaque. You can see that off my light in the background here. This becomes opaque. It lowers the light, but then you can shoot with the sun. You can block the sun from hitting somebody's face. Like when we were talking about, if that's the sun and I'm shooting that way, I could put this up and have somebody over there block the sun. So they're kind of in the shade of this, but this becomes a nice, really soft light. And you can get a bunch of blue sky back that way. So let's have a chat quickly about why lighting goes wrong, why your blue sky goes wrong. So when I am photographing this way, I get a really good blue sky, right? When I photograph my favorite way of somebody being backlit, because they've got a nice huge blue light that's really soft, and they're not squinty from the sun, the downside is, even though I can see that there's a nice blue sky back there, my camera doesn't capture it. And the reason that is because I have to open up the exposure. I have to give a lot more exposure to them, because when they're facing away from the sun and they're lit by a blue sky, it's about 6 times less light than when I shoot the other direction. So let's see, 2 times 4, 8 times less light. And if we're talking in terms of stops, there's 3 stops. A stop is a doubling. I'm getting into jargon already. There's a whole bunch less light. There we go. When I face that way, that makes me open up my exposure. When I open up my exposure, it brightens them so I can see them, but it also brightens that blue sky. And when I make that blue sky 8 times brighter, it goes from the blue that I see to almost a white. And sometimes it'll be totally white. And so when you get back and you look at your photos for the first time, you'll go, hold on, that sky used to be blue. Or if you look on the back of your camera, how come I'm not getting a blue sky when I can see it? And that's because it's just overexposed now. So one of the ways we can fix that is to do what's called bracketing. Recommend looking that up. We'll do a full lesson on exposure bracketing. And my thinking on that is that data cards are really quite inexpensive for your camera now. So if you shoot multiple exposures, you just go through and you pick the ones that have like the right balance. We're going to look at that in a minute. While we're talking about exposure, today is a special day for me, which I'd love to have a big shout out to AC/DC. AC/DC and I are partnering on a project. I'm super excited about it. It's one called Wham's Eye. I'll tell you what Whamsai is. It's my personal workflow that I use for photography. Now, when I became a photographer, I actually ended up being a photographer from being a recording engineer. As a kid, I wanted to do two things in life. I wanted to make music. Weirdly, I wanted to make radio commercials. I can't tell you why. And I also wanted to photograph movie posters and make movies. Those were the things that I wanted to do. And at the time, there really wasn't an option to become a filmmaker, so I was a hobbyist photographer, and I became a fairly successful recording engineer. Well, in my time, music went from analog on tape to digital when I was starting out. And then as computers got faster, we had digital cameras. I got the first digital camera, and that was the immediate change for me. I'm bringing this up because as a recording engineer, workflow was super important for me. When you look at those big, huge recording consoles that we had to work with, even in the digital world, still huge, there's a zillion buttons on there. And it's really important if you're going to be good at what you do to know what the workflow is. And so that if you change this knob here, you're not changing something down there. And there's an order. And if you know your order, then you can sit down at any console and you can be super efficient with probably 5,000 buttons. Well, it occurred to me that there's something similar about the camera, and that when I went out to do shoots, that I'd usually set for aperture, and I'd look at the back, and at a 60th of a second, I'd set that. I'd take a shot, I'd look, I'd make some changes, I'd dial it in. If I had to get quick shots, I might miss on the first couple of quick shots, which is a serious bummer. Most of us experience that. The other thing for me as a pro, and especially in the last 5 years when I've been working with celebrities or kind of like VIP kind of people where I literally have 2 minutes to get a shot, I can't lose my first 20 seconds dialing in the shot. I need to get it from shot one, because I want my 2 minutes. I want all those frames in that 2 minutes. And if their handler or they want to look at the shots, I don't want to be making excuses for bad shots on the back. I want to get all the shots. We all want to get all the shots. So I came up with a workflow, and it turns out, I'll tell you what it is. No secrets here. I call it Whamsai. It stands for white balance, aperture, metering, shutter speed, and ISO. And if you work in that exact order, you can set your camera up and set it up once, fire, take the shot will be right, and all your shots will be on the money. And so every time I go into a photo situation, especially like a stressful one where I'm under a time constraint or I've got to get them right, if I'm shooting an ad and there's monitors up around the place, so hair and makeup, they've got their own monitors, and then I've got the client there, I've got the model over here, everybody has got a view of what's going on. I do not want to take bad shots and have everybody looking at them. So I stop, I say to myself, Whamsai, and I just run through it. I go white balance, aperture. So I put together a course of Whamsai. It's a little over an hour. It explains the workflow and the why so that you know exactly why you do it. We're keeping the price super accessible because I just want you to get out there and take awesome photos. I have had a wonderful career as a photographer. And one of the big differences for me is that simplifying workflow, I see people take photos with these, and when the tool is out of the way, when you can just be an artist, you can take great photos. It's awesome to be able to have the same approach with a DSLR where you're not thinking technically. I'm a great technician. Did I just say that? I'm gonna go with it. I'm a great technician. But even then, I know that if I'm in my technical mind, I'm not being creative. And so the goal is to get creative as fast as possible. So that's why I came up with Whamsai. So thank you, AC/DC, for partnering on this. We got a super special price, half price. So please check that out and feel free to give me some feedback on that, or let me know things that you have questions on. I'm here to help. I'm kind of in the latter part of my career. I had luminaries when I was starting out who took care of me, and I thank them for it. And it's my turn to pass the torch to people who want to be creatives and really enjoy photography. So I'm happy to pass that on. Let's take what we know about what we're talking about with blue skies, and I'm going to show you samples inside AC/DC. AC/DC Ultimate. Here we go. Let me pull up a little picture-in-picture of me. Yes, I'm there. Hi. Okay. I got a snapshot here. There's a reason I have this snapshot. So this has a really nice blue sky, right? Well, the reason is that is hard sunshine. And so like I was saying, when you shoot with hard sunshine on your subject, that's going to give you your deepest blue sky. Now, if that model turns around to look at me, she's going to have kind of harsh light on her face from like harsh sunshine, and she's going to be squinty. And so though I can get like lots of detail on her hair like that and a really deep blue sky, if I turn around, I'm not going to have a great photo anymore. That leaves me with two choices. And so one of those choices is to go with the reflector. So this shot here was done with a scrim, and there's somebody holding the scrim section in the sunshine right over the deck, right in front of her. They're just out of frame. Let me go back to there so you can see that. Pull me up again. So just out of frame, if you look down at her elbow, you can see there's bright sunshine there. So she's not completely covered in this shot. And that's what I wanted to show you on this one. You can see now that the sky is not quite as blue as the other one. And there's a definite softness about her skin tone. The contrast overall is reduced on this shot. Well, contrast is something that we can punch up if we want to, but this one has a beautiful softness about it. I will go to the shot that was actually used, and there it is. And for me, this is right on the money. And so if you look at the posts here, these are bright white. You can actually see the edge of the scrim here. There's like a slight curve going on there. And just on the front of her dress here, bright sunshine's hitting the front of that and throwing some sparkles onto here. So even though the scrim is too small, you can actually use that. And so honestly, super effective. Now, if you check out the blue sky on this one, the blue sky is a little soft, or it's not as deep as it could be. So let's go in and have a look at this image. So one of the things that we could do is under General, we could take our dehaze slider. Dehaze will pull some blue into there. It's kind of like it takes the white out of the sky. Now, the downside you'll find to dehaze is that it'll start getting, it kind of does contrast and saturation all at the same time. And so skin's going to become oversaturated really quickly, which it does in this case. So I might roll a tiny bit of that in, but I'm not loving it. Now, one of the difficulties that I find especially with ocean shots where you've got blue water, blue sky, and you want skin tone, and I'll show you, it's this. If we look at our white balance, now I shot this in, what am I after? RAW, sorry. Okay, so RAW in actual fact doesn't record a white balance. The white balance is all done in post where we are. So we're working in post-production, and it's done by the computer. Now, if I move the white balance down and we ignore her skin a second, I can get some nice blue water. If I increase the color temperature of the white balance, she'll start to get a really warm skin tone. And there's something that's nice about the warmth somewhere in here, but I'm doing it at the cost of the blue ocean. And so we've got two choices. One, we can find the happy place and be done. So that'd probably be the happy place for me, where she's got like a warmer skin tone and I'm still getting a blue. But here is the Alec. I'm going to call this the Alec guess. I know a little bit about what we see from testing that we do. And it's testing that we do with goggles and how people move their eyes around for advertising. And we know when people look at say exposure-wise, that we don't see exposure like a camera because our eye physically adjusts, and so does our brain, to see into the shadows and see the highlights. But there's something that also happens with color. And so we can look to the blue water. We actually see a very small amount of what we think we see. So we'll look to the blue water, we'll find it really blue, and then we'll look back to the person, and then we'll optimize for their skin tone. Now, the camera doesn't do that. The camera takes one version of the photo, and for whatever reason, this is the answer that I don't know. When we look at a photo of somebody, our eye doesn't adjust anymore like it does in real life. So in real life, we'll look to the water, we'll see nice blue water. We'll look to the person, we'll see nice skin tone. When we look at a photo, our eye doesn't adjust in that way. My guess, this is the Alec guess on this one, and you know, if anybody's got an actual answer on this would be great. I suspect it has something to do with the color temperature of the backlight of the screen that we're looking at, or the paper that we're looking at it on. And so not all the frequencies are present in the same way, and so our eye doesn't adjust anymore. Kind of like locks it in. So one of the things that I love about AC/DC is that we can treat different areas of the photograph separately. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to click on the develop brush, and this show brush strokes here, we're going to make sure it's turned on, and I'm not actually painting her red. I am just taking the mouse and drawing over her, and it's showing a selection, and I can toggle that on and off. So if you happen to be doing this and it doesn't show up, that's what's going on, is it's just not toggled. It's handy to be able to toggle it to see where you're brushing. Okay, so I'm just going to keep in mind that everywhere I am brushing currently, I want that to be something that I am going to warm. There we go. I'm going to turn that off. This is going to allow me now to warm just her. And you can see that I now have completely separate control over the exposure of our model from the background. And so I can take her exposure a tiny bit down. I can add a little bit of contrast, a little bit of warmth, and gosh, I think that looks fantastic. So now let's move back. We'll turn that brush off. We also have the choice of looking at color EQ. Now our blues, we don't have any blue on our model. So one thing we can do is we could take the saturation of the blue up and deepen that. What you'll find though is, remember in the other shot that was brighter, or sorry, the other shot that was lit by the sunlight, what I said happens is when you're taking a picture of a model and you have to open up the exposure, because we used the scrim, right? And so the scrim makes the light on her darker, meaning I have to open up the exposure on the camera. I have to give the camera some more exposure. Gives exposure to everything. So our dark blue sky now becomes lighter by the amount that I had to lighten the exposure to get her skin tone. What you'll find is if you take the lightness, which another word for that would be brightness, right? We can take the brightness of our blues down. And you will find that when you take the brightness of the blues down, here we'll brighten that up. See the water? The water becomes a deeper tone as I darken that down. Then when I add saturation, it won't be fakety. It'll be like that deep blue sunlit sky. And now I've got the best of both worlds. So if we move on to our next photo, we'll go ahead and save that. We'll have a look at some problem photos. I take problem photos too. Sometimes I take snapshots. I did not say whamsai to myself. I just picked up my camera and took some photos. This is back at my wedding, the morning of my wedding. We were at a villa in Mexico, and that's my stepson doing a little yoga teaching. Now I have this poorly exposed shot. We'll go into general here. What we'll find is if we go, let's look at our light EQ. We can open up the shadows. And when we open up the shadows, things will look a lot better. Now I went in and I found this one for a reason. You can see there's mountains in the background. Now our sky that's up behind him, that was actually blue with warm orange tones as the sun was rising down here. And we might be able to pull some of that in. So we'll go up to General. Our fill light also is a way that we can get our foreground. Our highlights, if we pull them down, we might get some data into the background. There we go. And now we're starting to see a little bit of that blue sky. There's a reason that I brought this photo up. I don't think that this is a great photo in any way whatsoever. What I wanted to show you was that a photo that actually looked like poorly exposed, because it was shot in RAW, and there's way more information in the RAW picture than we can have in than we can show on a screen or in a print. There's a lot of information we can save. What you'll find more often than not is when you properly expose, like I'll show you in this next shot. Sure, we'll go ahead and hit save on that. This shot is taken pretty much at the same time, and this shot is now exposed properly for everybody in the foreground, but because it's exposed properly in the foreground, our background, they're backlit, right, is blown out. And there are no mountains in the background this time. So one of the things that we can do, we can take our highlights and drag them back. And lo and behold, would you look at that, there is in fact mountains back there. And as I pull that harder, we'll start to see, excuse me, a little color roll in. Now our foreground got a little dark. We can roll in our fill light. There we go. We got some good exposure there. We'll take our white balance. This is morning, dawn, right? Should be a warm color. There's, you know, excuse me, a nice orange glow to the sky. That's not showing up in this photo. So we'll take our color temperature and warm it slightly. What I'm finding though is just like that does not at all look real. The sky and the ocean are warming, but that doesn't look right in the foreground, and that is not my memory of what's going on. So if we stop and think about the light a second, these guys, especially their backs, oops, I grabbed that. Excuse me. These guys, especially their backs, they're lit by a blue sky. It's blue back there, and it's orange on the front. We can't see what's being lit by orange. We're seeing what should be lit by blue. So this should be orange up here and blue down here. Well, we can't go in and fix that with color EQ, right? That was where we pulled down the brightness of the blue sky a little bit. That's not going to be fixable. So this one is definitely going to be a brush fix. So what we're going to do for this one, we're going to go everywhere that should be lit up by the warm orange. So the water is reflecting the sky in front of us, right? So that should have that warm orange tone. Our sky should have the warm orange tone. And our foreground is probably about right. So we'll take that, and then we turn off the brush stroke because we know where we painted. We'll crank up the color temperature, which gives us some warmth. We're not seeing a ton because it's actually too bright. It's too white. So if we pull the exposure slightly down, that would actually make things a little gray. But to gray, we can add color. And so that will warm things up quite a bit. But I wanted to show you, like, this is a truly problematic shot that you're not going to, you know, it's never going to come out like it should have because I shot it wrong. Had I shot it right, I could nail it. But it's amazing when we shoot in RAW how much we can dial it in to bring a shot back that was way, you know, it was well overexposed. And for me, the story is about, in this one, is, you know, it's got sunrise and it's got water, and those two elements, they weren't showing up. So even just a quick kind of botched job like this kind of saves the story. And I think that's super important. We're all storytellers, right? And I think that's what I love most about photography, is the idea that we can tell stories. So from there, I am going to hand it over to Adam to finish up on taking you through slider basics. I know there was a whole bunch that was not about sliders in there, but I hope you got something out of it. For me, what I would like to do is to be able to give you little camera lessons and take your camera lessons and then apply them into AC/DC Ultimate. Ultimate is a fantastic piece of software as a digital asset manager. Honestly, it is the best one there is. And then when it comes to editing, to have the power of Lightroom or Photoshop in here, I think that is fabulously amazing to have at home at such a low cost. So everybody, what I would love for you to do is get out there and share. When we tell stories and we take the time to make great images, we really are making the world a better and more beautiful place. I think that's a really fantastic goal. Thanks for joining me today.
Obviously, there's going to be a little bit of a section here right now where you can see my video a lot cleaner. Again, this has to do with the draw in regards to Alex, like sort of the transmitting of Alex videos through Zoom. It was sort of a bandwidth issue with Zoom. So, but now I'm going to be doing the second section of this workshop. I'm just going to open up the Q&A, make sure I have all these panels open. Yeah, sweet. Thank you, Tony. Yeah, so this will obviously be available. Alex section will be totally available. I'll post it, post it on our YouTube channel. Okay, I'll just get everybody's screen here. Just up here, participants, cool. And then we have, let's see here, also grab the chat panel. There we go. Okay, yeah, again, yeah, appreciate the sort of the jarring aspect of the little bit of the difference in terms of the presentation quality there. But anyway, thank you so much for participating, obviously, guys, where we're still working out the kinks and trying to figure out how to do this in a meaningful way. And obviously, there's a lot of people that are really stoked on the knowledge that Alec brings. Right, so yeah, so the question I got was like, okay, when you're in AC/DC, okay, how much of these terms that we sort of just gloss over in terms of like, so when we're looking at the filter menu and when we're looking at like adjustment layers, there's a lot of terminology that we're using within these tools. For example, within the exposure, lighting, and color section that I think we kind of take for granted because we can see what they will do to an image, but I would like to have a better understanding of those basic terms and pass that knowledge on to everybody else. So yeah, just to wrap up in regards to Alex's process before I start talking about contrast and saturation and color and all of these things, is that so Alec basically started a class called WAMC with AC/DC, and so you can go to our YouTube tutorial section. It'll be on our website, and you can purchase that course where he teaches you all about basically his workflow for DSLR cameras. So if you use a DSLR versus something like a mirrorless or something, and you want to learn more about that, that process is awesome. Yeah. Robert says, yeah, exactly, Robert. Yeah, so it was just because of the processing be in between like Zoom and also whatever he was, because it was all live, transferred live. So, okay. But anyway, I'll link to that. So it's right here. So if you go to the third one, Alex videos, sign up for WAMC, and then also there's a coupon code which we're offering to anybody who's participating in the it's for DSLR specifically, yeah, not for mirrorless. But if you're participating in the workshop, we have a coupon code that's good for the next 2 days. So our text 2 hours rather, which is this coupon code here. I'll add it there. And you can check out his course that he has. Cool. Okay, but without further ado, let's actually get to the topic here. The course, I'm not sure whether or not it's a one-time course, so you'll have to shoot me an email about that. Yeah. Okay. There we go. My email is just in the text that in the chat there. It's let me just send that to everybody because I realize. There we go. There you go. Right. Okay. So yeah, so let's talk about this. So yeah, so I'm in this position where I'm like, I realize I'm utilizing these tools all the time, and I never really talk about the sliders themselves, and like these specific functions of color. Yeah. So basically, in ACDC, in order to sort of describe a lot of these things, I'd like to sort of utilize a really simple tool, which is this foreground color picker when we talk about contrast, saturation, light, hue, that sort of thing. But specifically, when we look at an image, okay, and I have this image of our cityscape here, the first thing that we're trying to determine is something like visually, we're trying to determine how much contrast an image has. And what contrast is like the differences in color and luminance that make an image distinguishable to the human eye. So, and the thing that's really interesting about contrast is that the human eye specifically is way more sensitive to contrast than it actually is to straight, like, true objective luminance. So when we're looking at this image has, it is decent contrast, okay? But you can see that there's like a significant difference between the area in the background here, which represents the area of the background of the city, which has considerably lower contrast and much higher saturation, much lower saturation than that of the front of the image, which has much higher contrast and which has a different structure to it. So when I'm showing this image, if we actually, so all I've done here is I've created basically an image with two layers, okay? And in one layer, I'm just gonna have the base image, and in the other layer, we can make an effect to this to just illustrate the difference that we're talking about here. So I've got this layer one, copy one, and what I'm gonna do is to illustrate this, I'm just actually gonna go down to exposure, because exposure adjustments will allow us to illustrate contrast. If I clip this image to the image beneath it, so click that little button that's right there, the diamond button, it'll just be applied to layer one, copy one, which is this right-hand panel side here. And let's just drop the contrast and see how this affects our image. So when we drop the contrast on the right-hand side of our image here, what we're seeing is a ton of gray, right? And there's a real interesting reason why that gray occurs when we drop our contrast. Let's illustrate that. So when you have this image with all of these different colors in here, when we drop the contrast, we're basically filling the image. We're filling the image with these different sort of midtones and grays that share very similar red, green, and blue values. So I want to take like a deviation away from contrast, because now in order to understand what's going on to this image, we actually start to have a conversation about color. And the best way to do so is to look at this foreground color picker, because it illustrates so clearly everything that's going on in an image. So how did I get to that? So if I click on this little foreground button, it'll bring up this color picker, and then I'm just gonna go to custom, which is the second tab here. And let's have a look at what's going on. When we see an image, we're seeing a mixture of a hue, okay, which in layman's terms is essentially just a color. We're seeing the saturation and the brightness of the image. So when you're looking at an image in a like a post-processing sense, not like using your eyes, but in a sense that what is being represented on the screen, brightness is represented by the addition, okay, or the subtraction of light. So, and when we look at this little column here, when we click brightness, you'll see that our sort of our color picker illustration here is changed, because when you click on hue or saturation or brightness, they have a different visual representation. You'll notice that there's this bar on the right hand side, and that bar represents, in this case, the subtraction or the addition of light. Now, all I want to illustrate is that when I increase this, right, that number that's right next to B representing brightness will be raised. So that number will go to 255 being the most bright, okay? And an image that is fully dark with represented by 0. And as I raise these, the brightness, you'll notice that the values, okay, of red, green, and blue are raised alongside those values, which indicates to us that when we're representing the color, or I guess the brightness that is fully white in a post-processing sense, okay, the value of that white is 255 units of red, green, and blue, and a culmination of those things. And if I lower those values to 0, you'll notice that to represent black, we need 0 units of red, 0 units of green, and 0 units of blue. So brightness is really essential to when we're going to be talking about in relation to contrast. Dory asked, do you need to shoot in RAW to do this? No. This is, I mean, all of these functions, right? These RGB functions that we're talking about are universal to photography and universal to post-processing. And part of the reason why I wanted to talk about these things is because often in ACDC, I talk about like all these sliders and utilizing these sliders, like why you want to use those sliders, but I never really ever talk about the concepts of hue, the concepts of contrast, and the reasons why, like what these actually do to an image. So that's what we're having a moment to talk about now. So to answer your question, Dory, yeah, no, you don't need to be shooting in RAW to do this. This is just sort of a look at color theory in general. Okay, so brightness is represented by the addition or subtraction of light, okay? Let's talk about hue now. This is going to be the second thing, and then we'll talk about saturation at the end. But so hue in the foreground color picker here is represented at the top where it says H. So HSB, RGB. H being hue, and then if we increase these values, so if I say increase the brightness of my color to 255, and it is a fully saturated, in this case, yellow is a culmination of a fully saturated hue of yellow is a culmination of 255 units of red and 255 units of green. We actually just slide this over to green or red. Yeah, perfect. I'll just 0 out those values. Oops. That's good. But you can see that each of these true hues, so hue is essentially color in this sense. Hue is represented by a single number, and that number is right here, where I have highlighted right there. The technical description of hue is the degree to which that a stimulus, in this case green, can be described as similar to or different from another color, be it red or blue or whatever. And the way that we determine that is by this figure, this unit here. So if I move the slider that exists on the right-hand panel here, you'll notice that that number changes. So in essence, the number, the hue of this sort of lime green color here is 51. If I raise it to turquoise here, the value, the number of turquoise in this case is 131. If I raise it to the very top to true red, it's 255. So these numbers, provided that we have a fully saturated image and an image where the brightness is set to the maximum brightness, that number will change in accordance with the color that that number represents. So when we talk about, so we've talked about like having, so basically when you have your color, right, your color pink or something like that. Well, if we were to have a pink of a brightness of 0, that's represented by black. And then each increment that as we raise it up, you can see that the values that change are the brightness, the red, and the blue as we increase those values. So at the very top, it looks like this pink is represented by 255 units of blue and 237 units of red. But the actual number of the hue, this particular pink, right, hasn't changed at all. So the interesting thing, I guess, is when we start to look at saturation. So saturation is the center value here. So we have hue representing a true color. We have brightness representing the degree to which that color is visible, like is bright or is fully dark. So saturation, which is that center value, is the, and this is a very subjective term because all of this is very subjective to the human eye, but saturation is the colorfulness of an area judged in proportion to how bright it is. So when you click on the saturation button right there in the center and you set the number, so set it to somewhere in the middle, so let's say like 150, okay? What you can see is that the preview panel on the right here, it changes to represent that. And as you move this cursor, the degree to which your image basically contains that level of brightness. So we're in this case, we're lowering that saturation or increasing that saturation. Fred asked, I'm confused about hue and why I would want to change it. Appears the image is completely unaffected by these adjustments. Oh, okay. So we're not there yet. I'm just talking about like these values. I haven't actually made any changes to this image as of yet. I just want to explain these concepts because they exist everywhere within the software. Like when I go to change color values, like using color EQ or color balance or white balance or whatever, like I'm fundamentally working with these three things. I'm working with hue, I'm working with saturation, and I'm working with brightness, okay? And then when we work with exposure and lighting, then we start to have greater conversations about contrast, and we're also working with these same values. So, and like I said, I've done so many workshops where I just move sliders around, right? I do this all the time. But I never really stopped to explain like what's actually happening, and that's why I wanted to do this workshop. Okay, so we're still looking at saturation here. So when you click on the saturation button and set the number in the middle, like 150, your color can change as you move the cursor. So you can see that my saturation number is still 159 right there, okay? 159. But as I move it, you'll see that I'm changing the hue and the brightness. So I'm not changing the saturation of the color, but I'm changing the hue, the color, the true color that it is, and the brightness, the degree to which, I guess in this case, white or black is a component of our image. Okay? So as we move that cursor, we may notice that the spectrums that can be described, though these spectrums can sort of be described as tints, tones, and shades, okay? So a tint is a color that incorporates some degree of white. The degree to which it incorporates white is, it lends itself into what we would refer to as a sort of a brights or something like that within the software, and we'll talk about that shortly. A tone, okay, is the addition of gray, not white, but gray to a hue. And then a shade is the addition of black to a hue. So when we're working within the saturation field, right? We're in essence, if we raise or lower these values, we're interacting with different, in this case, we could lower the saturation of this image all the way down to the very bottom. And we were working with colors that really represent, in this case, more of a tint, okay? Let's look at a different image here, and I'll actually start to address a previous concern one of my other users had. Let's do this. So, okay, let's have a look at the color EQ tool, actually. Let's just pop it open. So color EQ is a component of the color filter panel. It's right here. So we have the saturation slider here, right? So if I lower this saturation slider, you'll see that our image becomes essentially gray. And the reason why it becomes gray, here, I'll just open up another active run of AC/DC so I can show this to you. Let's open up that exact same image of our city here. Let's just open this one. And let's look at, in this case, we'll look at both. So we've lowered the saturation. Our city is totally gray in that image. But if we're looking at the color picker, right, in this second one, oops, there we go. What happens when we lower the saturation of an image? We make the image like closer to white in this case. We reduce this image until it basically has no values that would be represented other than white. And as we can see this because the brightness is still set to 255, meaning it's maximally bright. And in this case, the red and green and blue values are all 255, which represent that this is being displayed as fully bright. But the thing that's so neat about this is because in this image, there's no bright lime green. It doesn't exist, right? So we're not working with like perfect hues. We're working with a bunch of tones, like midtones and shadows and highlights. We're not working with any perfectly green, in this case, fully green images that were represented by 255 and a brightness of 255. So what's happening, okay, when we lower the saturation is we're making our image gray. And the reason why is because we're working with all of these tones that aren't like a truly bright color. I'm going to illustrate this because I find this fascinating. I think it's so cool. Let's go to a different image where I have one, in this case, truly bright yellow, and then a mid-tone, I guess, like a different one that has a bit of a degree of, in this case, blacks added to it. Okay, so an image that isn't fully saturated. So when we lower this saturation, what you're going to find is that this yellow here will turn to white, and then the sort of I guess like brownish looking color that we have above it is actually going to turn to closer to a gray. And that's exactly what's happening in that image that we had of the cityscape when we go to lower the saturation, is because our cityscape is primarily composed of colors that have a degree of blackness in it. So let's illustrate this. I'm going to click on my vibrancy adjustment, and I'm going to have this apply to all of the layers beneath it, and I'll just lower the saturation. So interestingly, if that image of the cityscape had a truly yellowy yellow in it, when you reduce the saturation, that yellow would be represented by white. But because that image doesn't have those true colors in it that way, all of the colors are these various homogenizations of different types of gray. Let's go back to that image and discuss that as well. I think this is neat too, because let's have a look at our color picker again. okay, so here's our image. Let's go back. Let's remove this guy, activate that. Why is that gray? Oh, it's because the base image is. Oops, I will do this again. There we go. And I'll just get rid of this mask. So when we're looking at our saturation bar again, right? The center bar, if I have an image that's, like I said, it's like, let's just use the color picker. Let's select a color. So let's select this tan that exists right on the face of this building. Okay, so I'm going to select it using the select function of the color picker, and then it's going to give me that hue. So we have a hue of 17. It's a color that is represented by 177 units of red, 117 units of green, and 79 units of blue, and it has a brightness of 117. Right now we have the saturation set to 141. If we then lower this value, you'll see that this color represented here is a gray. So when we desaturate this hue at that brightness, we get that gray. Let's do it again. Let's look at something different. In fact, actually, let's look at this like white that we have here. So its saturation is already super low. Its brightness is really high. It's actually closer to like a fully saturated color. Sorry, a bright color, but it still has a low saturation. If we do it again, we look at, say, let's look at this brown color that exists on the side of this building here. I'll click here. I'm represented with a hue of 10. It's got a values 143, 101, and 88. And then I reduce the saturation, and you'll notice that that color turns to like sort of like a darker gray than the gray that existed with this yellow here. So my point being that when I go into vibrance and when I lower that saturation down, like I have here, the colors that are being presented to me are equivalent to if I just color picked every individual color in here and lowered that saturation field down. So if I selected a value and lowered the saturation. And you'll notice too, which is kind of cool as well, when I select any of these colors with this image that's been fully desaturated, that number or that value is 0 because when we made that vibrance change and we lowered that saturation, we can see that that saturation has been represented by the quality that is 0. So, okay, let's increase this value now. Let's crank it way, 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 way up. Okay, so when I go to color pick one of these fully saturated colors now, well, it probably won't be fully saturated, but it'll be high on the saturation spectrum. If I select that, you'll notice that the saturation number is way higher. So it's 243. Okay, that's really close to 255. It's almost fully saturated. That's okay. So Anne just asked, the color picker has an OK button. Does clicking OK make changes to the image, or do you use the saturation slider? No. So again, the foreground picker is just basically previewing or seeing these elements that are in our image. When I go to, in this case, when I go to actually change the saturation slider, which is in the vibrance here, all I'm doing to you when I have the color picker open is providing the context to what is happening when I lower or raise this slider. I'm just illustrating to you using the color picker as a sort of like a guide, a tutorial, if you will, of what's occurring in our image. So when we have this image at a base saturation, so it's natural taken saturation, the saturation, that point of shoot. So when they took that image, it looked something like these values, right? So you could still see that there's like partially saturated colors in here. Most of this image seems to be quite gray. And actually, we have a pretty low contrast in these top portions here. But when I go to increase that saturation, again, I can see that these values are altered in this mode. Their saturation is increased based on those values. And this is actually a good example because this red down here is super saturated. So we can see that that value is 255. Okay. Let's see here. So Martin asked, so why did the brown orange color not desaturate when you moved the slider? So why did the brown and orange color not desaturate when you move the slider? So when I move the saturate, all the colors are adjusted. Like all of the colors have either have those values increased, so their saturation is increased, which means that their colors seem more vibrant to the human eye. And when we decrease those values, they become more gray. So they do change. Oh, again, so the color picker is not a slider. So the color picker is just showing us what is going on when we change those values using the vibrant slider. This is just an illustration as to what's occurring here. Okay. Okay, so there's another point. So many of you have talked about in the past and asked, like, what is the difference between vibrancy and saturation? So when I lower saturation using saturation, the slider right here, my image becomes gray. Okay. The same is true for when I open up this image in, let's go into Color EQ and use the saturation tool here. So when I lower that saturation, the left-hand side of our image, that slide, is desaturated. When I increase those values, they become more saturated, just as we described earlier. But there's a secondary slide here, and that slide is vibrance. And a lot of people confuse these tools. So vibrance, when we lower it, it's going to do the exact same thing. It's going to, in this case, reduce the saturation value of this section here. But when I increase it, you'll notice that there's very little change from here to here, not like the saturation. So when I increase saturation, it's quite a bit more orange. The sky's affected a little bit more. When I increase these values, it's much more subtle. And so why would we use vibrance over saturation? Well, where vibrance is used is really neat. It's actually more for adjusting skin tone than it is for adjusting true saturation of an image. I have this as an example. Let's go into another image here and let's illustrate this. So if I go back into the Color EQ tool with our new image here, with our subject here, okay, you're going to see that when I increase saturation, this whole image is going to change, all of the elements within this image. So if I go to increase this, our saturation in our oranges are increased, our saturation in our yellows are increased, our saturations in our blues are increased. All of it is really grotesque. Well, actually, I mean, the blues in her cardigan is nice, but in the case of, like, obviously her skin tone changed dramatically when we increased the saturation. Well, the value of vibrance is that when we increase it, her skin tone stays very relatively the same, while that red is increased, and then her shirt here in this case is dramatically increased. So what is that saying? Well, it's really cool because vibrance, when you increase it, it doesn't increase the values of the color orange as much as it does every other color. Why orange? Orange, no matter whether or not you have a subject like this woman here who is black, right, has a black skin tone, or whether or not you're like Caucasian or Asian or whatever skin tone you have, that is still a variation, an increase of saturation or a decrease in saturation or an increase of light or a decrease of light for all the purpose of seeing this as a skin tone. So my point is if we go and we use the color picker again, right, just on our subject's skin, I'll go to custom here and I'll select right here. Well, you can see that that color obviously is brown because that's the color of her skin, but it falls under the hue, in this case, the hue that is 15, which is very clearly orange. If I slide this field up, I make it more saturated and I make it more bright, it's very clear that that color, the hue that I have selected, is in this case orange. My point being that when we increase vibrancy, orange is the only color that it omits. So when you go to if you want to make your image of your family more vibrant, but you don't want to impact or don't want to affect anyone's skin tone, this would be the way you do it, by subtly tweaking vibrancy, because in this case, it omits the value that is skin tone. Okay, let's take a look at some of the questions here. So Barbara asked, can I do this to only one building, all else black and white? Yeah, you can make selections and change colors. Yeah, thanks, Wilbert. I appreciate that. Yeah, again, this is like just looking at color and color theory, and like, because we spend so much time adjusting these fields because we intuitively know what they do. Like I know what vibrancy does. Like I know what happens when I change these values. Like my eye sees it, but I want to help understand what's actually happening in the back end. Like what numbers are changing, what actually physically changes. And to understand what's happening in the back end gives us better control or understanding of how to use tools like vibrancy or color EQ, whatever. Yeah. Yeah, so in this case, yeah, like I said, all of these skin tones all come down to if you, doesn't matter who you are, unless they obviously have changed the pigment of their skin using whatever, you know, then it's always going to come down to variations on the hue that is orange with adjustments in regards to the brightness and saturation. Also, interestingly enough, we can actually deem the hue by just using the color picker itself within edit mode. Because you notice as I roll the color picker along skin areas, the values that exist to the right of our subject here are presented. And that's hue information, right? 214 red, 155 green, and 123 blue is a hue. It doesn't tell us anything about the saturation or the brightness, but it definitely tells us a lot of information about what hue it is. Remember, when I roll this up, when I roll the hue slider up, those values change. The green, the red, the blue, those values change in accordance with what hue they are. So whenever I just roll over and it sees that information, you can see that that's giving me information about what hue it is. And actually, interestingly enough, if I highlight right there, it's clear that that's true black in our image because it's represented by 3 zeros. And this is actually kind of cool too, because if we go into, if I think it's levels, let's take a look. If I go into levels as a tool and I click on the exposure warning, let's see here. Oh, it's not really represented that well in this image. That's too bad. Wonder if I can see it better in white balance, maybe. When you're in develop mode, as an example, so I could take this image into develop mode, I'll just discard those edits. There's a functionality that which shows you parts of your image that are exposed and underexposed and overexposed. So we just determined earlier by using the color picker that that part of this woman's hair is true black. And that's actually represented really interestingly using the clipped shadows and highlights tool. When I click this button, it indicates to me, the viewer, which parts of this image are represented with a true highlight, meaning 255 units of blue, red, and green, or alternatively, parts of the image that are represented with 0, 0, 0 units of those colors. And black is has the preview. In this case, the shadows are previewed using, I guess, the color green. And then when I do that with an image that has a lot of white in it, for example, so we can go into this image. Hopefully, there's a true white here. Not really, but there would be illustration, or but rather, it would show us parts of the image that would be red. I wonder if this does. Oh, there you go. There's a good example. So that shows us units of our image that are represented by 255 units of white, green, red, and blue. Okay, let's talk about midtones, tones, and highlights, because we've already done a lot of the work here, and I think it's neat to talk about these things as well. Okay, so we've talked about hue, we've talked about saturation, and we've talked about brightness, which are what comprises of all colors that we're seeing in a post-processing spectrum. But in that discussion, when we were talking about saturation, I mentioned something like I was talking about tints, shades, and tones, right? Which in this case represent, so like a tint would be a color that has more white in it. A tone would be a color that has more shades, or more, I guess in this case, our shade would be a color that has more blacks in it. And then in the center would be something like a tone that represents a color that has more gray in it. This is really fascinating because almost every image you're ever going to take is going to be comprised predominantly of midtones. Okay, let's go into Light EQ to illustrate this. I'll click here. So I'm just going to click Light EQ from the left-hand panel. Light EQ has a couple different modes in it. The first one is a one-step mode. The second is a basic mode. Third is standard, and then advanced. Let's talk about basic to start. Or actually, let's talk about one step to start. When I increase Light EQ, I'm adding, oops, let's turn that off. I'm adding, I'm taking the values in this image, and all I'm doing is I'm adding white to them. I'm bringing them further up the spectrum of brightness only, okay? When I look at something like basic, I now have 3 of these tools. I have shadows, midtones, and highlights. When I make midtones much darker, okay, it's going to take all of the colors that have more variations of gray within them and make those colors darker. Alternatively, if I take those midtones and raise that up, colors that are represented in the center of our picker are going to be increased in brightness. And the same is true for, oops, oh, I did not mean to do that. How do I get it back? Oops, let me see, filter menu. There we go. If I increase something like shadows, it's going to bring up the whites in this case, or it's going to bring brightness into the areas that are represented as having more blacks in them, further down the spectrum, closer to the number that is 0 in terms of brightness. Alternatively, too, if I make those darker, it's going to take all of those elements that are close to the value that is 0, and it's going to make them 0. It's going to bring them closer to 0. And then the same obviously is true for highlights. The reason why I take a moment to talk about the Light EQ as a method of doing this is because as you go up the steps, right? As you go from like one step to basic to standard to advanced, you notice that more sliders are added here. And what that means is that in basic, it's basically grouping blacks and shadows into one category. It's basically grouping all of these tones in the center into one category, which is midtones. And then it's grouping all of the brights, the lights, colors, and stuff like that into one thing, which is highlights. And when I open it into standard, I'm given 2 more sliders, right? I'm given a slider now that represents like true blacks, a slider that represents shadows, a slider that represents midtones, a slider that represents highlights, and a slider that represents whites. So there's basically more gradation, okay, between that and the basic method. And then importantly, the same is also true for advanced. The difference between standard having 5 of these sliders, well, advanced doesn't use sliders, but it does have 100 increments, okay? Instead of standard having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 increments, that has 100 different increments where you can increase or rather add brightness to variations of colors within your image. So all we've been talking about is how we can look at hue, saturation, and brightness in correspondence with every single tool that adjusts or rather changes colors within the program. Yeah. That sort of comes to a conclusion as to what I was going to talk about. I'm just gonna have a look in some of the comments in here and see if I can answer any questions as I go. Yeah. Oh, so Brenda asked, how do you get back to a slider to 0? So if you at any point utilize a slider and you change a value, almost every slider in AC/DC, if you just right click on the slider, it will reset its values back to its original, like at point of shoot values. So just right click on a slider and it'll boom, set it back to its initial values. Good one. That's a great question. Yeah. So Martin asked, so why did the brown and orange color not desaturate when you moved the slider? Oh, right, we already talked about that, didn't we? Yeah. I guess somebody asked earlier about talking about like how do you change the color of one area. So if we were to saturate just one particular part of our image, I mean, I've talked about this in depth with using masks, but if we were just doing it using a filter, so say we go back into the color EQ section here, and I deem that I want to only increase the saturation with this part of our image. Oops. What's going on? There we go. Okay, just get rid of this. If we do it just on this building here, we can use the brush tool to just increase selective areas, very similar to what Alec was doing earlier with the woman when he increased the exposure on her, right? If we were to just use this brush tool, which is represented up at the top, and then that's where we can do something like increase the saturation of the orange for just this specific building. Yeah, so that answers that question. Thank you. Very useful as always. I'd like more tips on the interpretation of histograms in a future workshop. Yes, we can talk about that as well. Actually, histograms is something too that I need to do a bit more research on because they can be very complicated. Not in a sense that's like not useful. They're very useful. It's just they represent a lot of utility within softwares like these. They're very useful. Thank you, Barbara. How do you delete some of the brushwork? So earlier, when I mentioned right-clicking on a slider to reset it, that also goes for every brushstroke. So if you just right-click on a brushstroke, rather, the same effect is going to apply, and it's going to remove it. And to turn off brushstrokes so that you can preview what the changes to that, you just can click that brushstrokes button right here, and it turns on and off the area that would be affected. Everything that we've talked about today also applies with pixel targeting. And in these brushstrokes that we've talking about, so when we increase the orange in this area, right, it works in culmination with the brushes. So let's say I've brushed this area of our building. This is our orange building here, okay? Let's set some pixel criteria as well. So I want to target every single tone of this image. So again, we're seeing familiar terms that we talked about earlier. We're talking about blacks, we're talking about shadows, we're talking about midtones, we're talking about highlights and whites, which are a culmination of different levels of saturation and brightness. And if we were to say increase oranges and reds, okay, that's going to apply to our whole image. So it's going to seek that in our whole image. But we have this brushstroke set to just this building. And you'll notice that with this brushstroke active and pixel targeting, it's much more refined on what it's selected versus when pixel targeting isn't active. Do you see the difference there? Do you see that building becomes less red and it's much more refined? So if we then hide brushstrokes and we were to increase these two values, that is a much more subtle adjustment than if pixel targeting wasn't active. You'll notice that the building color changes pretty dramatically. Here's a previous, so you can see. So with pixel targeting and brush strokes active, right there, okay, back to the original image, okay, and with pixel targeting not active. So only brush strokes and maximum red and orange saturation. So those three units work in coordination with each other. When you adjust pixel targeting and brush strokes, you're going to just select those. In this case, we've selected two hues, orange with high saturation and red with high saturation. And then we've brush stroked just this building and increased just these values. Bonnie asked, I've been using dehaze to improve, add color to old faded photos. Dehaze is really useful for that, yeah. It doesn't add color per se, but it does remove, it basically addresses saturation issues. What is actually happening when I do this? So dehaze is kind of like a, it's very similar to using the levels tool. So when we use the levels tool, right, it's a really interesting function. Dehaze would be very similar then to basically taking this midtones, so everything that isn't a true black or a true white in our image, and if we slide that further up, okay, when we slide that value further up, what we're doing is we're saying, I want to have more blacks added to midtones in our image. When we slide that value down, okay, what it says is I want to add more whites to our midtones in this image. My point is that what dehaze does is very similar to adjusting levels in this way. So if we take a dehaze function, okay, and we compare the two, you're going to notice very similar levels of contrast with a difference in, I think, the sky. So active dehaze, okay, like that, boom, and active levels like that, boom. The difference being, so we're gaining a lot of texture and sharpness in this area when we have dehaze on, right, from that. But when we activate the levels, just levels, we're gaining just texture, we're getting better contrast in this area, but we're not getting sharpness out of it. So dehaze is like a custom filter that incorporates basically adding midtones to your image, or rather darkening midtones, and adding a sharpness. The utility of this is literally to do what it says. It's to get rid of fog and haze in images. And why it's useful, I guess, is specified right here. In this part of the image, we can really see a lot more of the contrast come through in our image than necessarily with using levels. And this is what I would describe as haze. So, yeah. Ted asked, actually, you know what? Okay, so I'm going to say at this point, I would say that the workshop in regards to sliders and with Alex's portion is officially done. But I will remind everybody once more before I sort of answer some of these last questions. I'd really like to just point out that that if you have a question, okay, please email me and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Obviously, to everybody that stuck around for the beginning portion with Alec, we will definitely work on the quality of the video if we're going to do another workshop like this in the future. This is just the first time we've done this, and sometimes that happens. So apologize for any blurriness in regards to the actual picture. But I imagine a lot of it has to do with just running this through basically 2 units instead of just like I'm doing right now, doing one. And then so we upload all of our workshops to our YouTube page, so you can find those just in the link I supplied. And then lastly, if you'd like to watch any of Alec's videos, fully produced videos, they're on the link I sent right there, the Alec Watson link. And then if you'd like to sign up for WAMC, which is a course that he created that ACDC is selling on our website, you can use the coupon code WAMC -AUJR, and that will give you $5 off at the point of purchase. So that is, again, all WAMC is a Alec Watson helping people figure out a best workflow for taking, in this case, DSLR images. Okay, so images with a DSLR camera. With that being said, I'll have a look at some of the last questions before we sign off for today. But that was it. I really kind of wanted to just bring it back to brass tacks and talk about contrast, brightness, hue, saturation, vibrancy, and midtones and that sort of thing in relation to all of the tools that we use in AC/DC. Every single one of these sliders, right? All they do when we adjust those values, they change they change those numbers that I mentioned earlier. The hue number, the saturation number, and the brightness number. That's every single tool in this software that changes the visual perception of the image. That's all they do. So it's like that's really important to understand what happens when you change those numbers. Thank you, Julie. Awesome. Thank you, Lori. I really appreciate that as well. Thank you, Gary. Yeah, I'm sorry for the blurriness on his end, but that's just the way it is. It's not blurry on mine end because it's literally just me recording a screen. It's not having to go through a transition process. Thank you, Dory. Thank you. I'm probably going to butcher this, but it's Christoph. Thank you, Christoph. Thank you, Wilbert. Really appreciate you tuning in once again. Obviously, one of our most frequent flyers over at the workshop. So, thank you, Dasharath. Appreciate that. Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Stephen. Awesome. I'm glad you have a greater understanding of HSB. We will talk about curve levels, curves, and histograms. In fact, actually, that'll be the next workshop I set up. That's a really good topic and it forces me to like learn about these concepts as well, because like, sure, I'll use them every day, but I want to know intimately what they do. Oh my God. Thank you, Freddie. Thank you, Massimo. It's good to see you again, Massimo. Thank you, Les. Thank you, Freddie. Thank you, Gary. Pixel targeting 50 words or less. Sure, I'll do that right now. Pixel targeting is a tool used for making accurate selections, and the selections revolve around the tonality of the image and the colors in the image. That's all it is. It's a tool for selections. Thank you, Berger. It's good to see you as well. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Donald. Thank you, user. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, John. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Scott. Galaxy S9. Cool. It's good to see you too. Thank you, Meng. Thank you, Ken. Cool. Yeah, I'm glad. Oh man, I'm so glad that worked out. A little bit shaky to start, but I always appreciate that. Okay. All right, well, I'm going to sign off for today. Like I said, if you want to sign up for Alex's course, please do so. Use our coupon code. It gets you $5 off. If you have any questions at all, please email me. That's what I'm here for. I answer emails. If you have any suggestions as to what you want to see feature-wise in the software, please email me. I send those suggestions to our developers. We're a small to medium-sized company. If you want something in the product and you email me, it's probably going to be in the product at some point. And then lastly, if you have any suggestions for future workshops or tutorials that I make for our YouTube channel, please email me as well. And I always try to do my best to make those. So I try to get back to everybody that I can. Please do that. Jillian, can you send me it again, perhaps? It's possible I didn't see that email, as I get a lot. And if you send it again to me, I will 100% get to it. Sorry about that. It's also possible I didn't receive that, but I will try to get to it as soon as I can. When's the next webinar? The next webinar is on the 23rd, and it's just going to be me, and it's just going to be talking about restoring an antique photograph. Now, my coworker Andrea, she did a really interesting series on that, but they're short tutorials, and I was thinking like, oh, there's probably a lot more to talk about here. And I have a bunch of old photos I'd like to adjust anyway. So it's going to be talking about like working with those old photos and trying to get the most out of them, reducing grain, adding color, adjusting any negatives if you have negatives, that sort of thing. So it'll be a useful workshop. It'll be an AC/DC Ultimate 2020, and we'll predominantly be working with predominantly going to be working with an edit mode, I think, for that one. I've yet to decide, but yes. But a lot of that can also be done in develop mode. Thank you, Conrad. Margaret. Yes, restorations. We'll talk about them. Stoked. Thank you, Paul. Dodge and burn. Yeah, we can talk about that. And actually, dodge and burn would be relevant for that workshop as well. So yeah, we will get it on YouTube. Thank you, Ted. Oh, thank you, Margaret. That's awesome. Okay. All right. I'm not seeing any. Oh, here's one. Gian Piero. Gian, okay, hello. Can we highlight an area with a brushstroke to isolate it from a slider changes that we want to apply to the rest of the image? God, that's a great question. I think so. That's a great question. Can we just not change that one? Yeah, okay. So we're going to do this building again, right? Okay. John, I'm going to brush off this building, okay? And I'm like, I want to change everything about this building. This is my accurate selection of the building. It's a terrible selection, but I think if we do, okay, so we can clear the brush strokes, but we can also invert all of the brush strokes. Boom. So if we invert that brush stroke, and then which is this little button right here, invert all brush strokes, and then we like saturate our entire image, you'll see that the rest of our image has been applied, that saturation has been applied, but our building that we made our really bad selection of is not adjusted. So that's it. I think it just comes down to selecting your subject and then inverting that selection, which you can do obviously with a mask, but I'm just illustrating it using a filter. Yes. And that'll be the case in develop mode as well. Okay, there you go. Yes. Some people notice that I'm working with a 4K monitor. So if your monitor is not at least a 1080p, if it's basically, what's the word for it? 12:9, I want to say. If it's if it's not a standard or not a HD resolution, it might look a little bit odd. That has come up in the past. Anyway, that's it for me, guys. I got to sign off. This has been a long workshop. That's that's an hour and a half. But please, like I said, email me. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And if you, like I said, if you've got questions, comments, suggestions, feature suggestions, I'm the guy to talk to. Anyway, and for all of you, thank you so much for participating. I really appreciate that, and have a great rest of your Thursday or Friday, whatever day it is for you in your part of the world. So.